So, first of all, I'm Ryan Steggy. I'm the program manager for Decarbonization, and welcome to this special interim modeling update. I hope you were able to join us for our 4 prior workshops. If not, they are available for viewing at oppdcommunityconnect.com, as well as we have an excellent 20-minute recap video over those 4 workshops. So even if you weren't able to attend, or if you were able to attend, I would still suggest you watch that recap video because it really helps you remember all the content that we provided and kind of gets that thought process going again. So this update will be recorded as well and available after the event. And I would like to acknowledge with us today one of our board of directors, Director Spurgeon. So thank you for joining us today. And I'd also like to recognize if there's any other elected officials or community leaders joining us. Thank you for your support as we embark on our Pathways to Decarbonization study. So today's update, it's really a special additional update that we hadn't originally planned, but we believe this is really valuable, especially with all the excellent feedback and engagement that we've received from our stakeholders. Both the OPPD and E3 teams have been hard at work behind the scenes the past few months, and we added this workshop really to provide a greater level of depth and transparency on our modeling efforts. I can't understate the amount of work that these teams have really been have been performing here recently, and I sincerely thank them for all of their efforts and for taking the time to share that with our stakeholders. As many of you know, we've had our challenges lately, such as a record-setting storm, but this team has met the challenges, they persevered, and they continue to do some amazing work. So again, thanks to the team for preparing this update, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We encourage your interaction, and we really do value it, all of your comments and feedbacks, and you'll see later in our presentation some of the ways that we've taken your feedback and comments and incorporated that into our study to make it a more robust process. All right, so we value safety at OPPD. It's a top priority for us, and we start every meeting with a safety brief, and this is no different. And with the weather being pretty nice out, I think it's about 80 degrees today. This seems timely for us, some outdoor backyard electrical safety, especially as we move into fall as well. Get to enjoy these next few months of nice weather. So when purchasing outdoor extension cords for lighting or other activities you may be doing outside, make sure you are using the outdoor use extension cords. That goes for Christmas time as well for putting lights up. Your children or grandchildren or neighbors, make sure they see, recognize electrical equipment and recognize the signs for high voltage, danger, caution. If you see any lines that might be down or trees that are getting into lines, don't hesitate. Please call our customer service. That number is on the screen. And last thing I want to call out on there, if for any reason you're going to dig a hole for any kind of project, whatever it may be, make sure you call 811 before you dig. So Nebraska 811 is a free service. That's for anyone who's planning a digging project. That includes homeowners and professionals. And it's actually Nebraska state law that you call that at least 2 full business days before performing that dig. So they will, the utilities will come out and they'll locate the lines free of charge. So, all right, let's stay safe and enjoy the remaining summer and upcoming fall weather. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to give you some more context on today's update.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Lake. I'm with the Stakeholder Engagement team here at OPPD. With that, I just want to welcome you again to this interim modeling update and just a couple housekeeping notes for now. Just a reminder to OPPD and E3 staff to mute your microphones when you're not speaking and silence those electronic devices, especially if you are on camera and you have your mute button off. This meeting, like Ryan had mentioned, is being recorded. Public attendees right now are in listen-only mode. Although this is an interim modeling update, we do have opportunities that we will engage with the audience. So those of you who have attended previous workshops are very familiar with how this works, but we'll have 3 different ways throughout the presentation that you will be able to participate. Poll Everywhere is a service that we've used in the past and we're going to be using again today to take some surveys, get to know who's in the room, just a couple opportunities for engagement throughout. And I will give instructions on how to log into that when we get to that, which is actually the next slide. We also are using WebEx Q&A. I have a whole team working with me here. Jamie Wagner, Jenny Raddick, and the team will be helping monitoring that Q&A. So if you have questions throughout, if it's a clarifying question about the content being covered, we encourage you to use that WebEx Q&A and ask our experts there, and we will respond to your question either verbally or through that Q&A chat. Also, there will be a few times throughout this presentation where we will want to invite you to raise your hand and speak to us directly and ask any questions or give us any comments verbally. Those times throughout the presentation will be noted, and Jamie will help identify you if you have your hand raised for a question, we'll take you off mute and we'll be able to have a conversation that way. So with that, we will move on to our first Poll Everywhere question. As I said, we've hosted 4 workshops so far in the Pathways Decarbonization Energy Portfolio Workshop series. We just kind of wanted to take a quick poll of the room to find out if you've attended prior workshops. So let me get this live here real quick. So bear with me just a moment. You should be able to see that on the screen. So what you need to do is either text OPPD1 to 22333, and then you'll be able to join. And then please just enter A, B, or C. A, if you have not attended any prior workshops. If you've attended a few, put B. And if you've attended all of them, please put C. If you're on your computer and you don't want to use your text, you can go to pollev.com/OPPD1. So it looks like we, at this point, according to the survey, we don't have any newbies. So welcome back to everyone who is here. A lot of people who have attended all of the workshops, so that is incredible. And just like Ryan plugged, we do have a really great video that we just posted yesterday. It's a summary video. It's about 20 minutes long, but if you wanted to take a look at that video, if you did miss any of the workshops, it'll give you a nice summary of what we've covered so far, and you don't have to sit through 8 hours of workshop. So again, I'm going to plug that for anyone who would like to watch that video and share it with your friends and enjoy. Okie doke. So let's go on to the next question. We also want to know who's here. So for this, you can just text us your message. Do you represent any organization or yourself as a customer? And if you'd like to share your name and who you represent, we welcome you to text us here. You don't have to, but it's just a nice way for us to know who's in the room and for all the attendees to know who else is watching along. So you should be able to text OPPD1 to 22333 and just tell us your organization that you represent, your name, or however you want to identify yourself. So Omaha by Design, welcome. Oh, we have a board of directors. That's awesome. Metropolitan Community College. Jennifer Glazier, welcome. Citizens Climate Lobby. Alan Vilvoca and Francis Mendenhall, great to see you here. City of Bellevue Planning Commission. John Crabtree, welcome from Sierra Club Beyond Coal Campaign. Louis Lester. Nebraskans for Solar. This is great. Glad to have so many people. Ryan, welcome from Creighton. John, good to see you. Let this go for another moment and then we'll just move on. Got a good crowd. And again, this meeting will be recorded and published. So if anyone's not here, if any of your friends or other members of your organizations want to attend and they weren't able to make it, look for a recording. We should have it up by Friday on OPPD Community Connect. So with that, I will switch back to our presentation and switch it over to Ryan and Colton. Colton, I believe it's you.
Yep. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining us today for another update on our energy portfolio project. So today's topic is the interim modeling update. The last workshop that we had back in May was focused on our modeling approach. And since then, the teams, OPPD's team and E3 have had their heads down working hard on the technical aspects of the modeling. And so we do have a few results to share with you today, particularly around our reliability and resource adequacy modeling and our resiliency scenarios. Those are all really important topics that set the foundation for the optimization that we're doing for our resource portfolios and pathways development. But before we go to E3's content and a review of those results, we're also going to provide an overview just of the project and the context of this update within the workshop series, and also focus on the connection of this project to OPPD's Integrated Resource Plan, which we'll be submitting to the Western Area Power Administration in February of next year. And as Ryan mentioned earlier, we're going to spend a little bit of time focusing on the specific contributions and input that stakeholders have made throughout the workshop series thus far, and how that's actually shaping our study and being incorporated into our scenarios and assumptions. So we're very appreciative of all the feedback thus far, and it does make it into our project, and so we'll share a little bit of that. And then you'll also see in the agenda today that there's 3 periods for open comment. And so you can always text a question through the Q&A, and we'll try to respond, or we'll prompt it, and you know, either myself or Zach from E3 will address it. But we will have these periods where you can raise your hand and voice your questions or comments throughout the presentation as we go through results. And then lastly, we'll end on next steps, focusing on where we're headed and the modeling work that has yet to be done and the next workshop. So next slide, please. Let's start with just reiterating the objective of the Energy Portfolio Project. So the Energy Portfolio Project will study actionable pathways to eliminate or significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from OPPD's energy portfolio while balancing impacts on reliability, resiliency, and affordability. So we've started each of these presentations with that charter objective, and just want to remind the audience of that. And we've also discussed in each of the 4 previous workshops, we've discussed the different projects that make up OPPD's broader decarbonization program. And so OPPD is actually focusing on decarbonization across 4 different projects: internal operations, customer, this energy portfolio project, and the community project. And today you'll actually hear from Emily Muth about opportunities for stakeholder engagement in both those customer and community projects, as those are moving forward and really need stakeholder engagement throughout their process. So more information to come on engagement opportunities with those projects. And where we are in the overall workshop series. So we initially planned 6 workshops. We've completed the first 4, which we wrapped up at the end of May. And those were really around how we were going to solve for this future energy portfolio and different pathways, considering different technologies and different speeds. So we really looked at decarbonization across the economy and the multi-sector modeling. We looked at all the assumptions, technologies, and costs of technologies and fuels, and those were wrapped up into the key assumptions and scenario workshop. The last workshop, number 4, we talked about the approach that we were taking to use that information and develop these pathways. And in workshop number 5 is our workshop to actually share what those initial results look like. And that's really the workshop where we intended to get significant feedback on the types of pathways that were developed. But today's focus is really around where we are in the midst of modeling. And so, I will caveat that today's content is pretty technical because it has to deal with, some of the technical modeling assumptions that we've been working through and sort of the midstream work. But we're excited to have you here and share that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily briefly to share about the engagement opportunities that we have upcoming for our community and customer projects of the decarbonization program.
Thanks, Colton. Hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Emily Muth. I am the Sustainability Coordinator for OPPD. I also have the honor of leading the community work stream for this decarbonization effort. And so we have heard from you that you want to hear more about what's happening in the community and the customer work stream. Those are focused on, what can we do in the community to help engage others in this decarbonization efforts, and what products and services is OPPD offering also to aid in decarbonization efforts. So we'll have another virtual engagement session. Those will be coming up here at the end of August, 1st of September that week. We haven't yet pinned down the date, but as soon as we do, emails will go out just like we have for all these other workshops, as well as it'll be posted on oppdcommunityconnect.com. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Colton. Thank you.
Okay, and we also wanted to share the connection of this with our integrated resource plan. And so we've talked about this in previous workshops, but an integrated resource plan, also known as an IRP, is a legal requirement that a utility has to outline their generation changes to meet customer demands over time. It's a plan really for how that utility might accomplish its goals given a set of assumptions at the time that study's developed. And so I guess to be clear, it's, an IRP is forward-looking and it's directional and it's based on assumptions, and it's not a set of specific resource decisions, even though it includes decisions that have been made by the governing body or by the board of directors. And so OPPD is required to submit this every 5 years to the Western Area Power Administration. And our next submission is due at the end of February of 2022. Yeah, again, the IRP itself isn't a decision to add or retire assets, but it's a forward-looking plan of how the utility might serve customers based on the assumptions that are made in the study. And so, some of the particular, I did say that it also includes decisions that have been made. OPPD's 5-year IRP will include the decision that to convert North Omaha 4 and 5 from coal to natural gas. It's already been approved, and that's part of our 5-year plan. And it also will include the power with purpose decisions that the OPPD board has made on the pursuit of 600 megawatts of solar generation and 600 megawatts of backup natural gas generation for the Power with Purpose project. And this energy portfolio project is this part that you've been involved with and are continuing to engage with will be part of what our IRP filing is. It'll inform that IRP filing. And so your engagement throughout this entire process is appreciated, but it's also very important for us to understand your perspectives and include them in the work that we're doing. So we certainly appreciate that engagement throughout. And speaking of engagement, I would like to highlight some of the valuable feedback that stakeholders have provided thus far. And so we've had significant feedback, quite a bit on workshops number 3 and workshops number 4 and the data release that we provided. Those are the underlying assumptions that are going into our pathways development. And so some of the updates that we've made to our project in consideration of that feedback, we're including a scenario that has an increased level of load flexibility. And so this isn't just generation matching demand, but it's also how are we considering technologies that allow demand to match the supply of energy, that may come from renewable resources in the future. And so we've incorporated a scenario that has significantly increased flexible load, and we'll be evaluating that. We've also updated the data release that we provided to include a higher level of granularity and more of a breakdown on some of the assumptions, particularly the cost assumptions, so that those are more easily comparable to other sources of information stakeholders may have. And so the information is there, but enhancing the transparency of what we produced. And lastly, of these 3 updates, we've also incorporated stakeholder comments on inclusion of climate change impacts. And so when we're going through and modeling, it's a very data intensive process. And so, there's limitations on what data is available, but we've reached out to experts and are trying to get a better understanding of how the actual climate and temperatures are going to change throughout the time horizon of the project. And that's actually going to feed into our resiliency scenarios that we're going to discuss when we look to plan for extreme winter heat or extreme winter cold. We'll be taking the data sets that are available and using them to the extent that we can as we evaluate our pathways. So it's been terrific feedback, and really appreciate the focus of stakeholders throughout the project. We've also responded to a number of very specific questions on several topics, and you're free to send us questions and we'll respond to them, or we've addressed them in the workshop if you have those questions now. We provided confirmation to stakeholders that the specific scenarios that they wanted to see or want to see in the analysis are included. One example that stakeholders brought up is they'd like to see a scenario with no new natural gas technologies. And so we actually do have a scenario that captures that. It's our absolute zero mature only scenario where we're only considering technologies that are not producing emissions. And so we'll be able to evaluate that and the amount of technology, amount of resources, the type of resources, and the cost of those scenarios when we come out, with the initial results. And lastly, on behalf of OPPD and the E3 teams, we would like to thank you all for your participation in this series and all of the feedback and all of the surveys and everything you've done throughout the process. We read the surveys in depth every time, and we've tried to make modifications to make this engagement better and listen. So we really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Zach Ming at E3, and we'll move to the technical content for today on where we are with the modeling progress.
Great. Thank you, Colton. Hello, everyone. Nice to be back with you, and we're excited today to share some of our initial results that we've seen from some of the early stages of the study. So if we go to the next slide, Colton already covered a little bit of what we're planning to cover, but really the focus today is on the reliability and resiliency phase of the project. So we had a workshop several months ago talking about our methodological approach to reliability and resiliency, and we've done that analysis. We have that to share. Going to try to not repeat too much background on these topics, but for those that might not have thought about this at all in the past couple of months, we do have a brief refresh. And then we're going to end today talking about how we're going to use those reliability and resiliency results in the portfolio optimization, specifically how that feeds into the portfolio optimization. So if we go to the next slide, we can see here, again, this graphic should look familiar, but these are just the phases of the project that E3 is working on. So we've already presented the multi-sector modeling. Again, that is really, from OPPD's perspective, an exercise of load forecast scenarios, thinking about as the economy, rather than just OPPD, decarbonizes, what are different levels of electrification that might happen and what the impact on OPPD's loads might be. So if you'll recall, we have several different scenarios, a reference case where load grows moderately, all the way up to a high electrification case where load is more than triple what it is today. So we've already completed that, presented that, and again, what we're focusing on today is the reliability and resiliency analysis, which we've completed. And then we're already underway is the portfolio optimization phase. The reliability and resilience analysis is an input into that portfolio optimization. So that's in progress. And we're going to be talking about those. And then again, stay tuned for initial results, which should be coming out in a couple months to get stakeholder feedback on, stakeholder really input on. And then we'll use all of that in wrapping everything up with the final report and findings by the end of the year. So I think we can just jump straight into it. If we jump forward a couple slides. So this is the only overview background slide just to catch everyone back up to speed. But again, resource adequacy is a well-established topic in the electricity sector used by vertically integrated utilities and deregulated markets alike. And it's really just a measure of, is there sufficient or enough capacity on the system to maintain reliability? And the way that's done is by measuring a utility's peak demand and then determining a reserve margin or planning reserve margin, PRM, above and beyond that peak demand requirement, which sets the total capacity requirement. And so there's really two questions that are associated with this resource adequacy process. Number one, what is the total quantity of capacity that's required, or what is the PRM, above and beyond peak load, to maintain a specific reliability standard, such as the 1-day and 10-year reliability standard? And the second question is, how can different resource types contribute to that planning reserve margin requirement? And it used to be very simple to say how much resources can contribute. Firm resources generally contribute their nameplate capacity or their installed capacity, but with renewable resources and energy storage resources, it's much more complicated to quantify the contribution towards the PRM requirement. And so that is what one of the other critical analysis steps. And we are using, to quantify those resources, we're using a metric called effective load carrying capability, or ELCC, which we covered in previous workshops, which we think is, again, becoming the industry standard of how to quantify these resources' capacity contribution to the PRM requirement. The ELCC metric captures a lot of different effects, including the diminishing returns and interactive diversity benefits, which we'll be talking a little bit more about today. So we're going to be covering both of those key results. What is the total capacity requirement, and how can these energy storage and renewable resources contribute to that? And we've done a lot of analysis to extract those results. So next slide. Jumping straight into the first question of what is the total capacity requirement. So there's a couple different ways to think about this, but just to start from sort of a more intellectual exercise, we calculated what the PRM requirement would be for OPPD if it were its own islanded electricity system without any interconnection to other neighboring utilities or the SPP market. And what we found is that that requirement you can see on the right is 27%. And that's significantly higher than what OPPD's reserve margin is today. And the reason for that is because when you're an islanded system, you have no ability to lean on your neighbors. So when one of your plants goes down, you have to have the backup capacity yourself to cover for that plant. That is not the case when you're part of a more integrated, interconnected market, and that's exactly one of the benefits of being part of the SPP market. There's a lot of resource diversity that OPPD can take advantage of. When an OPPD plant fails, other neighbors have plants that can backfill, and vice versa. OPPD can provide support to neighbors when their plants might be unexpectedly non-operational. So there's a benefit. OPPD does not need to maintain a 27% reserve margin. They actually need to maintain a 12% reserve margin. You can see that 12% yellow dot on the chart on the right. And the reason that OPPD actually needs to maintain a 12% reserve margin instead of 27% is both due to the resource diversity, which we just discussed, as well as load diversity, which has to do with the fact that OPPD, when they experience peak load, is not necessarily at the same time as when other utilities, other neighboring utilities are experiencing peak loads. So if OPPD has a peak load, maybe other neighboring utilities have a bit of spare capacity sitting around that they don't need, and vice versa. OPPD can share excess capacity when other utilities might be experiencing peak loads. So there's a lot of benefits to being part of the SPP market. Those benefits are really what reduce the planning reserve margin requirement from 27% to 12%. And so we are capturing and reflecting those benefits of the SPP market in our modeling in setting the OPPD reserve margin. So how this actually feeds into our model, we are using a PRM that's equivalent to the 12%, but we're actually using an 8% reserve margin. You can see that value reflected in the left blue bar here in the chart. And this 8% is actually functionally equivalent to the 12% reserve margin, except for the fact that it uses a different accounting convention. So the accounting convention here is sometimes referred to as performance-based accreditation, but it effectively derates firm capacity or dispatchable capacity by its forced outage rate. And there's two reasons why this is beneficial. What this does is it allows all resources, whether they're firm dispatchable resources or renewable or storage resources that are being accounted for through the ELCC metric, it allows everything to be accounted for on an apples-to-apples basis. So everything is accounted for on a derated performance-based metric. Thermal resources or dispatchable resources are derated by their forced outage rates, and renewable resources are derated by their availability, due to natural wind and solar variation. Storage resources are derated by forced outages and other availability constraints like duration limitations. So we are using this convention, this performance-based accreditation convention or forced outage derate reserve margin, and that yields an 8% required planning reserve margin for OPPD. That is what is required to deliver a reliability standard of 1 day in 10 years. Any questions on this, or yes?
Oh, no, I was just going to go on if you were done.
Okay, sounds good. Yep, go ahead.
The next slide is actually an understanding check. So if you wanted to log into Poll Everywhere again, planning reserve margins refer to the amount of energy generation resources needed to meet reliability goals. Being part of the Southwest Power Pool reduces the margin OPPD must maintain on our own for which of the following reasons. So I will launch Poll Everywhere and we can see those responses. So which of the following reasons? A, power is shared by Southwest Power Pool members during planned and unplanned outages. B, increasing the diversity of energy load spreads peak demand across a greater time frame. C, greater diversity of energy generation resources across geographies minimizes the impacts of intermittent operations. Or D, all of the above. And it looks like that D line continues to grow and A changed their mind. So Zach, Colton, do you want to explain the answer here? Or it looks like it's pretty obvious.
The answer is D, all of the above. So yeah, the audience has got it. Being part of the Southwest Power Pool helps us share when we have an outage. We can rely on other generators. When they have outages, they can rely on us. We also peak at different times, so we can share resources when each of us is not at our peak load. And then for renewable resources, actually they're fairly consistent across the SPP territory, but there are differences where there might be cloudy in one area and not less cloudy in another area, and so there's the benefit of production in some places versus others. So that all goes into it.
Great. We will move on then. Go ahead, Zach.
Okay. So the previous slide just illustrated the metric that we're using, which is a performance-based accreditation method, and established that in 2021, the required PRM for OPPD is 8%, being part of the SPP market. So we can calculate that exact same value for future OPPD systems as load grows and load evolves for different years for different load forecast scenarios. And that's exactly what this chart shows here. This shows the required planning reserve margin for OPPD in 2030, 2040, and 2050 for 4 different load scenarios. So, the reference load scenario really is, the base load forecast, not a whole lot of increase in electrification loads, all the way up to the high electrification case, which are the green bars you see here in each column, and that is the highest load growth case. So this assumes very high levels of electrification and a complete replacement of building heat from the fuels-based heating systems like natural gas today to electrification heat. And what you can see is that in almost every single scenario in every single year, the target required planning reserve margin is actually pretty stable in about the 6 to 8% range, with the exception of the high electrification case in 2040 and 2050. And the reason for this is because in all the other years and all the other scenarios, the OPPD system is still a summer peaking system, which means peak load is occurring in the summer, really the middle of the afternoon, driven by hot temperatures, driven by air conditioner load. And so that the planning reserve margin requirement for that type of a system is relatively similar to what it is today when OPPD is also a summer peaking system. As in the high electrification case, OPPD actually, because of all of the winter heat that's transitioned from natural gas to electricity, in the high electrification case, OPPD would actually transition to being a winter peaking utility. So the highest peaks in the year would occur in the winter. And winter peaks are much more volatile year to year than summer peaks. And so that requires a significant amount of really planning reserve margin spare capacity to be able to accommodate the volatility and variability of those winter peaks. And so that's what drives such higher planning reserve margin requirements in a winter peaking electricity system relative to a summer peaking electricity system. And as you'll recall, we're going to be analyzing all 4 of these load scenarios. Our focus is really going to be, though, on the balanced case, the red set of bars. That is, you can call it a base case if you want to call it that, but we'll be performing the bulk of our sensitivity analysis on this balanced case, which, just to remind folks, has a significant amount of electrification, particularly vehicle electrification and building electrification for heating, but doesn't completely replace the natural gas system as a form of backup heat during extremely cold temperatures. So it's not a complete electrification. And one of the reasons why we're focusing on this balanced case is precisely because of issues like this around the high electrification case and how the extreme level of planning reserve margin increase could increase costs to the OPPD system.
Zach,
So,
before we can,
yes.
Oh yeah, before we continue, I just wanted to make a comment for those that are joining us and maybe weren't able to attend all the workshops. When you see moderate decarbonization case or net zero balanced case or net zero high electrification, those all refer to the scenarios that were developed around load in workshop number 2 for the multi-sector modeling. And so there's quite a bit more detail, in the presentation content and in the video recording of that workshop, if you're wanting to know more about the assumptions in each of those particular cases.
And while we have a quick break, I wanted to reiterate how the best way to ask questions that'll help us get to them in kind of a timely and orderly manner is to use that Q&A kind of button down there in the bottom right-hand corner near participants. When you send that, it allows us to kind of sort those and help go through those. And it's a much more preferred way than assigning any question to one of the hosts or anything like that. So if you have any issues, you can holler, but that'll be our preferred method for these questions until we get to the hand raise. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And I guess the other thing I'll reiterate on these different cases here, the moderate versus net zero really has to do with what's happening in the broader economy. In all of these scenarios, we are going to be building OPPD portfolios that achieve net zero. It's just a question of, is the rest of the economy going in lockstep with that? Is the rest of the economy going to achieve net zero, or is the rest of the economy going to only achieve moderate levels of decarbonization or not really pursue significant levels of decarbonization like in the reference scenario? Okay, so if we go to the next slide, this slide just really highlights some of the reasons for why winter peaks are more volatile than summer peaks and why we see the higher planning reserve margin requirements on a winter peaking electricity system as opposed to a summer peaking electricity system. So to develop our planning reserve margin requirements, we are using a significant quantity of historical weather conditions in OPPD. You can see we have peak summer temperatures by year for the past 40 years shown here on the left, as well as minimum winter temperatures for the past 40 years for the Omaha region as well. And so you can see that a lot of data gives us some pretty extreme peaks for both summer and winter. And we can translate those summer and winter temperatures into summer and winter peak loads. And that's exactly what the chart on the right shows. It shows the average summer peak compared to the average winter peak, as well as the range of summer peaks compared to winter peaks. And these are directly based on temperatures that you see here on the left. And what this shows us is a couple things. Number one, that on average, summer peaks are higher than winter peaks. The yellow bar here is higher than the blue bar, but the variability or volatility of the winter peaks is higher than the summer. And so in a winter peaking system where this blue bar would rise above the yellow bar, that would increase the variability of the actual annual peak load, and that's what would require the higher planning reserve margins for a winter peaking system. So there's a couple things going on here. So we are using historical weather data to develop these load variability forecasts, and that's what's feeding into the planning reserve margin requirements. So we do capture historical extremes, and so we might expect these extremes to become more common in the future as we experience climate change and as that increases. But we are capturing extreme events as they've historically occurred. As part of our resilience analysis, we are going to be looking at what if the extremes going forward are even more extreme or more frequent than the historical extremes that we've seen. We don't have a lot of really robust data on that. And so to analyze the resilience of the system in climate change, we're going to be addressing that through the resiliency analysis as opposed to trying to bake that into this resource adequacy analysis that you see here. So we're definitely aware that the planning reserve margins are based on the historical variability of weather, and we're going to be looking at you know, testing the system against an even more extreme level of hot or cold. And we have some slides on that coming up here in a little bit. But all of this, yeah, thanks for changing the slide. So everything that we've covered so far is really, from a resource adequacy perspective, focused on setting the total capacity requirement of the system. What is the quantity of megawatts that the system requires to maintain reliability? The next step in the analysis is determining the potential contribution from every resource and how it can help meet that planning reserve margin requirement. And again, we're using the ELCC metric for that. And this chart right here really shows some of the key results for that analysis. It quantifies the ELCC value of 3 different resources: energy storage, wind, and solar, at different penetrations or installed quantities of those resources on the OPPD system. So what you can see here is the ELCC value, that's the vertical axis, as these resources increase in penetration. And so the increase in penetration here is measured as a percentage of peak load. So what that means is just, 100% here on the horizontal axis. If OPPD's peak load is 5 gigawatts, that means this represents 5 gigawatts of installed storage or 5 gigawatts of installed wind or solar. And what this chart here shows, which again is OPPD specific, so it's based on OPPD loads, based on OPPD potential wind and solar resources, not just in Nebraska, but within the broader region, that can plausibly be interconnected and delivered to the OPPD system through the SPP market. And SPP has also performed these types of studies to quantify the ELCC of these resources, and we've found that these values actually match up fairly well with the values that SPP has calculated. There are some expected differences because OPPD's loads aren't quite the same as SPP's loads, and the resources that are deliverable to OPPD are a little different than the broader set of resources that SPP as a whole might be able to depend on. But in general, these curves here match up fairly well with the analysis SPP has done. And I will say these curves actually go out much farther to much higher penetrations of, for example, energy storage than what SPP has published in looking at these resources as well. But really the key phenomenon here that you can see is that as the penetration of every one of these resources increases, the average ELCC contribution of that resource declines. And this is a pretty widely accepted phenomenon that we see for these resources. It's often referred to as diminishing returns. And we walked through in the third workshop, our reliability and resiliency workshop, we walked through really the reasons for why we see these diminishing returns. So I won't repeat that there, but suffice it to say, not surprising that we see that same result here in this study as we've seen in many other jurisdictions and that SPP themselves has seen and that we would expect. So at the end of the day, these are the ELCC values that are, each of these resources can contribute to the total capacity need. There are diminishing returns, which effectively limit the total contribution of these resources. But one thing I do want to call out and highlight is that even if there are capacity limitations to what these intermittent and energy limited resources like storage and demand response can provide to the capacity of the system, that doesn't necessarily mean there are the same limitations on how much energy these resources can provide. So you can see the difference between those two concepts illustrated on these two bars on the right. The left bar shows the capacity contribution of resources as measured through ELCC, and you can see that the contribution of wind, solar, and storage might be limited and might require some type of firm dispatchable fleet of effectively backup resources. But the bulk or vast majority of the energy on this system might actually come from wind or solar resources, meaning that even though you have a firm resource on the system like natural gas, it might actually only be used 1 or 2 weeks a year when wind and solar are going through a prolonged period of low generation, and that natural gas plant needs to fire up but the other 50 weeks a year, the natural gas plant just sits on standby, and all the vast majority of the energy comes from wind and solar resources, with storage helping to balance out and actually make those megawatt hours deliverable. So that is one reason why, even though the ELCC contribution does have diminishing return and might be limited, that we don't necessarily see that as a hindrance to delivering a significant quantity of renewable energy that's ultimately going to be necessary to achieve the net zero reductions.
Yeah, before we continue, Zach, I just wanted to emphasize that point, that what we're seeing and what you've seen on previous studies is, although there's diminishing reliable value or capacity value of resources, that doesn't necessarily mean that those resources are in any way not contributing their share of energy to the portfolio. And so, just because they have diminishing reliability value, it doesn't mean that they're somehow discounted in terms of their value to provide valuable energy to help us achieve the decarbonization goal. It's really just a matter of how are we planning the right resources for when those other resources aren't available for protracted periods. And I know we have some additional content on that upcoming.
All right.
With that, we have our last understanding check for this presentation. So last poll EV, electricity systems need both energy generation and reliable capacity. Which of the following statements is true? So I will pull that up. Is it A, energy generation is directly correlated to generation capacity? Or B, an electric system with backup firm resources may only use these resources to generate small percentage of energy? C, demand response does not affect capacity? Or D, installed capacity is not required to exceed peak demand? Looks like 100% of people chose B so far. Maybe give another minute or second or two to have anyone else give any responses. Looks like we're still at B. Hopefully everyone's voting and everyone is answering B, where we have one person that's voted. Colton, Zach, do you want to explain this one?
Yeah, I think the audience gets it again. So there are resources like wind and solar. The more you have, the more they produce. But in a highly renewable portfolio where you're trying to optimize use of renewable energy, there are also backup assets or different types of assets that need to fill in pinch hitters for certain periods of time. And so that's what we see with these firm resources. And so B is the correct answer.
Very good. We'll move right along then. Go ahead, Zach.
Okay. So this next slide here, I think, highlights another really important outcome of the modeling, which really highlights the other important phenomenon that we see in assessing the ELCC of renewables and storage. The first, important phenomenon is the concept of diminishing returns, which we just discussed. But the second is that even though there are diminishing returns, we do see that when we add these resources in combination with each other, their aggregate ability to provide capacity is more than the sum of the capacities that are provided by these resources individually. And we discussed this idea of a diversity benefit, which is what this phenomenon is sometimes referred to, in the third workshop. And the illustration of why that diversity occurs is shown in this bottom left chart here. So I won't walk through that again, but you can revisit the third workshop for more information on that. But we ran the analysis on this. The results here are for you to peruse. And there's really the primary results are shown in this top table here, which is showing the capacity ELCC of storage and solar resources on the 2050 OPPD system. And so this table just shows the aggregate combined capacity value of solar and storage in 2050 on the OPPD system. And what we can see is that if we just look at this top table, this really highlights the diversity value. We have just an example here. We can see that for 3,500 megawatts of installed solar capacity, that yields an ELCC of 351 megawatts, assuming there's no storage. And for 2,000 megawatts of storage capacity with no solar, that yields an ELCC of 1,020 megawatts. But if we add both of those resources together, we get an aggregate ELCC of 1,819 megawatts, which is more than the 1,020 plus the 351. And so the difference between that 1,819 and the other two is the diversity value of these resources together. And that's shown in the bottom table, and you can see that that value adds up to 448 megawatts. And so this is really just highlighting that the analysis we've performed is capturing and reflecting the diversity, the positive diversity, the synergistic benefits of adding these resources in conjunction with one another. And ultimately, this table that you see here on the top right, this is the primary result of the reliability resource adequacy analysis that will be feeding into the portfolio optimization work to help select portfolios of wind, solar, and storage. What we've done here is we've calculated the combined capacity value of solar and storage. We have a separate ELCC curve for wind that has baked into it an assumption on the level of solar and storage to capture the interactions between wind and solar and storage as well. But the primary interaction between these resources is between solar and storage. And so this table right here is what's going to feed into the modeling in conjunction with specific curves for wind and demand response as well.
Zach, we had a question on how we're developing the ELCC for renewable resources. What's the regional diversity that we're including for those resources? And I did want to provide clarity that we're considering resources in OPP service territory and also spread out throughout Nebraska. So we have, a geographic diversity of both wind and solar resources that we're considering as we're developing ELCC values. Again, we know that the farther they're spread out, there's benefits in managing items or things like cloud cover or localized storms. And so, we do have that diversity across the state.
Yep, that's right. Thanks for answering that question. Okay, so the last slide here on our resource adequacy results is showing the hours of year that have the highest loss of load probability, which is really the primary driver that determines the ELCC contribution of wind, solar, and storage resources. So the tables here on this slide are relatively common outputs that are produced from these type of resource adequacy analyses. It's referred to as an LOLP table or loss of load probability table, and it shows the hours of the year where the system is most stressed, or the hours of the year where the system has the highest probability of experiencing a loss of load event. And so you can see these results are shown for each month, which is the vertical axis here, again, for every hour of the day, 1 through 24 hours on the horizontal axis. And what we can see is that for a system that has no renewables or energy storage, the highest loss of load probability hours, so this is just this top table here, the highest loss of load probability hours are really just the peak load hours of the system. Those are the hours where the system is most constrained and the most likely to experience loss of load. And for a summer peaking system like OPPD, those hours occur in the afternoon, in the summer, when it's hot, when air conditioners are on. And so you can see for OPPD, that's really the June, July, August, primarily July month from 2 to roughly 5 p.m. Now, that is very different from a system that has a high penetration of renewables and storage, like what we see in the bottom table here. And this is I would call it an illustrative result, since we haven't actually developed portfolios, but we've just chosen a somewhat arbitrary high renewable and storage portfolio for OPPD. Here we're assuming 6 gigawatts of solar, 6 gigawatts of wind, and 3.5 gigawatts of storage. And you can see that when we add all of those renewables and energy storage resources to the system, effectively what happens is there's a ton of solar production in the summer when loads are high. And so even though loads are high, there's also an abundance of energy production. And so that completely, effectively eliminates the summer afternoons as a challenging time period because there's an abundance of solar energy and a lot of storage to deliver that solar energy to meet peak loads. Instead, what we see is loss of load probability shifts from summer afternoons to the winter, and it spreads throughout the day because what is effectively happening here is the model is picking up that there are periods of the year, 2, 3, 4-day stretches where there's prolonged periods of low wind and solar generation when wind and solar cannot meet load and limited duration batteries, like 4 or 8 hour batteries, run out of charge, 4 or 8 hours into a 72-hour event, and the system has a insufficient quantity of energy for a couple of days until wind and solar output pick back up again. And so that's effectively what the model is picking up here when it's determining that the highest loss of load probability hours in high renewable storage system occur in the winter throughout the entire day. And the reason we see this in the winter is for 2 reasons. Number one, because solar is a very seasonal resource and has very good production in the summer. And so that production is what largely eliminates the summer as a challenging season, but also because we are adding a significant quantity of building electrification, electricity replacing building heat. And so that's adding wintertime load in a way that's not adding load in the summer. And so those 2 factors are both what's helping to push the loss of load into the winter season. And I will finally just add here that the reliability of both of these systems are equivalent. It's not that the bottom one is less reliable, even though it looks like there's a lot more red. Really what's happening is the red is just more spread out instead of being concentrated in just those summer hours. And the other important thing here is that there's multiple components of reliability generally. There's the resource adequacy component, which is addressing these loss of load hours, but there's also the resiliency component. And we can see, if we just look at, you see this black box here that shows the hours of the year in which the February polar vortex caused loss of load in the SPP market, we can see that that did not occur in summer peak load hours. And the reason that the system experienced loss of load was through a combination of high loads, but also primarily through a loss of generating capacity, generators that froze, generators that could not get fuel. And so having a system that is resilient to those factors is also important, in addition to just making sure the system has enough capacity to provide energy during the peak load hours of the year. Okay, and so that wraps up the resource adequacy section. And before we go into resiliency, I believe we're going to have a open season on questions.
Yes, that is correct. So we do have a couple of questions we can tee up from the Q&A, maybe give some of you time to form questions, but I wanted to remind how to go about doing so. So if you click the participant icon, it's kind of in the lower right-hand part of your screen, you can open the attendee list and find that hand raise button. Go ahead and click on that. I know we had at least one call-in user. For telephone users, just press *3, and that both raises and lowers your hand after you've been addressed with your question. But again, click the hand to lower it if that's the way that you raised your hand. So we can allow time for that. But Colton, this first one's a long one talking about the paired resources for ELCC values. Do you want to go ahead and tackle that? You or Zach?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it, and as I'm reading it, we'll figure out if it's Zach or myself. But how are the paired resource ELCC values translated into an input for the optimization model? Were they converted to a percentage, as in the declining ELCC chart on the previous slide, for standalone resources, and then paired solar storage resources credited a higher ELCC percentage than standalone solar or storage? And I think this gets to probably the technical use of the ELCC surface, Zach, that you had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, that's a good technical question. But short answer, yes, they are converted to percentages, and so that's why we often use percentages, because load is actually growing significantly over time. So the model needs percentages instead of absolute megawatts. But the second question is the first chart we showed you with just the lines for solar and storage. We're showing those lines really for illustration purposes only. Those lines do not go into the model. Only the solar and storage table that we showed goes into the model, and it goes into the model as percentages. And we use the line for wind, but not for solar and storage. We use the table for solar and storage.
Thanks, Zach. That's what I was going to say. I appreciate you verifying that for me. I've got another question. How does the availability of longer versus short-term storage affect these calculations?
Yes, so we are using the ELCC curve here is based on 4-hour storage, and we would expect that longer duration storage would have higher ELCCs. There are a couple ways to get at that. We can, what we actually use in the model is the ability of the system to build, when it's building storage, it doesn't just build 4-hour storage, it has the ability to build both capacity of storage and energy for storage, which can increase the duration. So to the extent that the model builds longer duration storage, then we will give it higher ELCCs. And I'm not sure if Aaron is on. We might need to get back on exactly the quantification of how we're quantifying longer duration storage, but at some point we would expect it to get to 100%.
Yeah, hi, this is Aaron Burdick.
Go ahead, Aaron. Sorry about that.
No worries. This is Aaron from E3. Yeah, just to confirm, we are modeling effectively a short duration battery product that will use the ELCCs that were shown here with their declining ELCC saturation effects that Zach described. And then we will be modeling different flavors of longer duration storage, either of the sort of 12-hour variety or the ultra long duration storage that is more like sort of a seasonal storage product. And those effectively aren't subject to the same declining ELCCs that we model for the 4-hour batteries.
So in other words, they get 100% ELCC?
That's right.
Okay. Not seeing any hand raises. We'll have a couple of other opportunities for that, though. So I'll go ahead and pass it back over to you, Zach or Colton.
Okay. Sounds good. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the resiliency analysis. So if we go to the next slide, we discussed resiliency a bit in the third workshop as well, but resiliency is less established than resource adequacy, what we call, and it's an emerging topic in the industry, but it's the ability of the system to anticipate, absorb, adapt to, and recover from disruptive events. And we said we were going to perform a resiliency threat analysis, which looks at really a spectrum of different resiliency events that could impact the OPPD system. And we have done that, and we have that on the next slide. And then as well, not only identify those resiliency events, but think about what potential solutions to those resiliency events are, and ultimately use that resiliency threat analysis when we develop the final portfolios to make sure that they are robust to these different potential events, and if necessary, make modifications to the portfolios using the solutions that we identify for each of these resiliency events. So we have completed that resiliency threat analysis. If you go to the next slide, a summary of that can be found here. And there's a lot on this slide, so we're not going to walk through this in its entirety. But just to give an overview, we have really groups of resiliency threats listed here on the left. You can see those broad categories of resiliency threats are unplanned outages, so events that reduce the generating capacity of the system either through mechanical failures or natural disasters. There's also threats from extreme weather, both winter weather and summer weather. Both winter weather and summer weather extremes really cause two primary issues on the system. Number one, they increase loads, and number two, they reduce often the generating capacity or availability of the system. So in the winter, you might have generator failures because of freezing issues or because of wind turbine icing, snow covering solar panels. In the summer, you might actually have deratings of thermal generation just due to thermodynamics, or even solar PV actually has reduced output at extreme temperatures. So extreme weather in the winter or the summer both increases demand for electricity and can decrease the potential supply availability of electricity. There are lots of different solutions to help mitigate this. You can see some of those on the right. The other big category of threat is around energy sufficiency, or what we introduced last time, this idea of a Dunkelflaute, which is the German term for dark doldrums, or really multi-day periods of low wind and solar generation. And on a system that is heavily dependent on renewable energy, this is a big risk that has to be accounted for. And this really is captured in the resource adequacy analysis that we've conducted. And so we think this risk is reflected in the ELCC value of wind and solar, but it's important nonetheless to call out as a resiliency threat and can be mitigated with essentially just backup firm generation capacity. Another important resiliency threat is around the impacts of electrification. So electrification has two primary impacts. Number one, it increases the demand for electricity and increases the supply requirements. But to the extent that society is electrified, it also increases the impact of an electricity outage on customers. So in today's world, when the electricity goes out, you lose your lights, you lose the internet, but you don't lose the ability to drive. You don't necessarily lose the ability to heat your home. In an electrified world, that you can lose the ability to do all of those things. And so the impact on customers can be much higher. And so that is why one of the reasons, for example, that we are focusing on the balance scenario as a net zero pathway, which really retains the natural gas system as a way to have backup heat and mitigates the impacts on customers in the event that there were to be an electricity outage. And the final broad category of resiliency threat is around cybersecurity, which I'm sure everyone on this call is painfully aware of the implications when that goes wrong. That is a topic that OPPD is laser focused on. It's a little bit outside the scope of this specific project, which is focusing on the energy portfolio, but nonetheless is an important resiliency threat that we do want to call out and just remind everyone that OPPD is focused on this topic. Okay, so this is the broad overview of resiliency threat analysis that we performed. As far as how we're going to actually use this in the analysis, if you go to the next slide, you can see that we have pulled out 4 specific scenarios that we plan to assess the different portfolios that we're going to produce in the portfolio optimization work to make sure those portfolios are robust and resilient to these 4 scenarios. So the 4 scenarios that we're going to focus on are extreme summer heat and extreme winter cold. Again, the idea that these increase loads and potentially decrease generator outputs. And it's in this step here that we're planning to incorporate the impacts of climate change, thinking about how might the system respond in a world that sees more extreme summer heat or more extreme winter cold than we've previously seen in the historical record. We are also going to make sure that the system is robust to an extended low wind and solar output scenario. Again, that's captured in ELCC, but is important to make sure that the system can get through multiple days of low wind and solar generation. And then finally, making sure that the system is robust to extreme localized events such as tornadoes or floods. So these types of events can damage or destroy generators for potentially very long periods of time. And so making sure the system is robust to these types of events, there are lots of ways to do that, whether it's through, for example, hardening the generators themselves, like larger, better, stronger levees around power plants that mitigate the risk of flooding, or also through methods like, instead of building one large generator, building multiple smaller generators that are spread out geographically, so that if a tornado comes through and destroys a generator, it only takes out one instead of the single large generator, which could take more capacity supply offline. So we're going to be focusing on these 4 resiliency cases and assessing making sure the portfolios we produce in the portfolio optimization are robust and resilient to these specific cases. And if we go to the next slide, just to dive a little bit into, again, this topic of extreme summer heat and extreme winter cold, based on stakeholder feedback, we actually have been in contact with the state of Nebraska climatologists and have gathered some really useful weather data on future temperatures and how climate change might impact future temperatures. You can see here, this is just one graph of, for example, summer days for the number of days per year that might exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit, both historically and going forward. And we can see that state climatologists expect this to increase over time as climate change increases. And so taking a lot of the data that's available to us through this resource from the federal government and using that to develop extreme summer and extreme winter temperatures to test the resilience of the generation portfolio is the step we'll be taking.
Zach, I did
Okay.
want to prompt a question that we have, and I think this is just generally around how we're evaluating the frequency of these sort of extreme events. The question is there an assumption used on the probability for polar vortex extremes, or sorry, is there any assumption used on the probability for polar vortex extremes will diminish as climate warms by 2050 and beyond? So I'll take a quick stab at that and say that, as we've been looking through climate change data, and there is quite a bit, one of the themes that we've heard and read is just increasing volatility as well as changing average temperatures. And so, I think at this point in time, we're looking at that condition for that extreme cold event and making sure that the portfolio is robust and resilient to that condition. And we're not necessarily looking at the frequency of occurrence. We're just looking at these extreme scenarios, and when we evaluate these pathways in the context of those extreme resiliency scenarios, we'll be looking to see if there's any meaningful deficiencies in how they might respond. So hopefully that answers it. But Zach, if you have more to add, feel free.
Nope, I think that covers it. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide.
All right. I haven't seen any hand raises, but this is your opportunity to do it once again. If you're on the phone, it's *3 to raise and lower your hand. If you're through, like the majority are through the WebEx, computer or phone, on that attendees box within participants, there's a little hand icon that you can click on to both raise and lower your hand. We'll still continue to take the Q&A as they come up relative to the topics being discussed, but wanted to give you a break to address any questions you might have. Okay. Well, seeing none, we have one more opportunity for that. So there is that, but I don't have any right now, so we can continue. Actually,
Okay.
before we go,
Yep.
got a quick one on the Q&A. Was there any effort to incorporate extreme heat from the 1930s, which exceeded recent records in your evaluations?
Yeah, I guess short answer is no. We have not used data back to the 1930s.
Right. Thanks, Zach.
Okay, so the last section here is really talking about how we're going to use these reliability and resiliency results in the developing optimal portfolios. So if we go to the next slide, you'll recall we had an entire workshop really focused around inputs and assumptions that go into the portfolio optimization modeling. That was workshop number 4. And some of those inputs and assumptions are around topics such as the cost of these resources, the technologies that are available, and the availability of those technologies. We have a number of different scenarios that look at whether or not certain emerging technologies become available, or whether we're stuck in a world where we only have existing mature technologies available to help decarbonize. Tons of different inputs around factors like that. And one of the other really missing piece to actually performing the portfolio optimization was calculating the resource adequacy ELCC of these potential resources. And so this was the last big piece of analysis that we needed to start on the portfolio optimization modeling. So this is already underway. We're working on this right now, taking all those inputs and assumptions that we released to stakeholders, as well as these ELCC results that you see here. We're going to plug that into the model, develop optimal portfolios for a number of different scenarios. If we go to the next slide, just want to briefly refresh on the scenarios that we are going to be running. So one of the big factors in running different scenarios is what the greenhouse gas reduction targets are. So we are first going to run a reference scenario that does not impose any greenhouse gas reduction targets. That's the black line that you see here on the top. And this effectively just establishes a baseline of, if there are no greenhouse gas reduction targets, what would the most economic, reliable portfolio be, and allows us to quantify and measure the impact of decarbonization scenarios relative to this reference case. Looking at, in a world where we achieve net zero carbon, what are the cost impacts relative to a reference case, or what is the total quantity of wind and solar that's built relative to a reference case? We introduced previously this idea that while the goal for OPPD is net zero by 2050, there's less clarity around the trajectory with which that net zero target is achieved. And so we introduced the idea of looking at 3 different trajectories to achieve net zero carbon. Both a straight line case, which is the blue line here, linear ramp down of emissions now through 2050, or an accelerated case, which is the gold line here, faster emission reductions up front, or a moderated reduction case, which is the red line, that has most of the emission reductions occurring in the back end. So we conceptually introduced this idea, but we now have specific numbers that we can put forward to stakeholders that are listed in this table here. These are really the constraints that are going to be going into the modeling when we look at each of these different reduction scenarios. And then finally, we have a net zero by 2035, which is a super accelerated case. And there was interest from stakeholders on this case. Also, this is aligned with some of the talk and rumors around federal energy policy. And so this is something that we want to investigate. And so we will be looking at that as well. And effectively, we will be developing an optimal portfolio for each of these different emission reduction trajectories. And in addition to that, if we go to the next slide, you can see some of the other sensitivities that we are also planning to run for. There's 2 main factors that we're going to be that we're going to be using in what we're calling our framing scenarios. So we've already covered this, but this is just a little bit of a refresh. For each of the different paces of decarbonization, which is this first row here in the table, which is exactly what we just looked at on the previous slide, which is how fast the OPPD system decarbonizes. For each pace of decarbonization, we're going to be looking at different levels of technology availability, whether we're only relying on existing mature resources, which is our mature only technology or scenario, or whether we have mature resources plus hydrogen resources plus other more questionable emerging technologies that become available as well. So we'll be running all of those technology availabilities for all of the different paces of decarbonization. And then for our base case, we will also be looking at several other sensitivity assumptions, which you can see listed on the rest of the rows of this table. We walked through this at a previous workshop, so I won't repeat all of these, but I will just call out that in addition to the previously planned sensitivity scenarios, we have, as Colton mentioned, added this flexible load scenario where we're going to be running a scenario that has a very high level of flexible loads in addition to the already moderate level of flexible loads that we had been planning to include and assume. So yeah, we've added that based on stakeholder feedback, and we are going to be developing an optimal portfolio for all of the scenarios that you see listed here, using all of the inputs we've covered, using the reliability results that we covered today. And we expect to complete that here in the next couple of months, at which point we will have an initial set of results to roll that out and gather stakeholder feedback and comments before finalizing our findings.
Okay. Zach, we do have one question that came up, and that's how will a federal price on carbon impact what we're looking at in these scenarios?
Yep, that's a good question. So we have a scenario to help us answer that exact question. You can see here the carbon pricing sensitivity. In the base case, we're assuming no carbon price, and we have a sensitivity with a carbon price. So this should really tell us what is the impact of a carbon price on the optimal portfolio. I will say that, it's not necessarily clear that a carbon price is going to have a huge impact. Effectively, what a carbon price does is push financially a utility to reduce output of carbon emitting resources to avoid the tax and to procure and use carbon free or low carbon sources. That is already what OPPD is doing based on the net zero goal and based on the trajectory of decarbonization. So the signal that's being sent through a carbon price is effectively something that we're already imposing on these scenarios. So it's if the carbon price exceeds the cost, could potentially encourage OPPD to decarbonize slightly faster, but it's not necessarily the case that it's going to have a huge impact relative, like it might if we were comparing it to a world without any type of carbon policy.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of clarification there. We don't expect it to have any impact on the portfolios or the pathways that we're really developing. I think there's probably a lot to be understood around how a carbon price impacts, organizations or utilities financially, across markets. But when we're looking at our optimization and what we're doing for the various pathways, we already have pathways that are significantly constraining carbon and are going to develop, low carbon and net zero carbon portfolios regardless.
Okay, back over to you, Colton.
Yep. And so I guess as we finish up the interim modeling update, and we'll have time for stakeholder comments as well at the end of this, we look forward to audience and members, attendees joining us for our next workshop, number 5, where we'll be sharing the initial results or the pathway results for our modeling. That'll be a pretty exciting workshop. I mean, it'll be the first time that we start to look at, what does the energy portfolio or pathways, what do they look like? What are the potential costs of those different pathways for the different timelines of implementation? So the team is still in the process of undergoing the modeling. And so as we kind of get closer to having those developed, we'll be proactive in communicating when the date is for that next workshop, later this fall.
So with that, I'll wrap up some next steps before we move on to our last public comment portion, where you'll be able to ask us more questions or give us any more feedback. As you know, we're committed to continued stakeholder engagement and feedback. So after this, as I think Colton, Zach, and everyone alluded to, we really do take those surveys to heart. We read every single response. And so we would ask if you would please take the time to either respond to the survey that you'll get. It's like a safe pop-up option as you leave the meeting. It'll direct you to the survey, or watch your email. We'd really, really appreciate your feedback as we try to improve our stakeholder efforts along the way. Also, next steps, as Colton mentioned, workshops 5 and 6, very important workshops, will be coming up very soon, within the next few months, I would assume. But please stay tuned for more details on that. We'll be posting the information on OPPD Community Connect, as well as contacting you through emails as well. Since you have come to this workshop, we will make sure to be in touch when those workshops are available so you won't miss it. As well as the community and customer engagement session that we also talked about, that Emily mentioned before, that will be coming up here pretty soon. And so as soon as we nail down that date and have the registration info available, we'll let you know. So hopefully you would be able to join us for that session as well. And you could learn a little bit more about those other projects beyond the energy portfolio. We mentioned the video several times. I hope many of you had an opportunity to view it as kind of a little refresher before this interim modeling update. But if you haven't yet, it's all over OPPD Community Connect. The best URL to remember is oppdcommunityconnect.com/decarb. You'll see it there along the sidebar where you can watch it. Also, if you came through OPPD Community Connect to register for this meeting, you'll find it on that page as well. We have it kind of all over the website because it's a really, really great reminder, summary video of the workshops that we've had to date. It's about, like I said, 22 minutes, I think, to be exact, but gives you a pretty good summary of the first 4 workshops along our journey of Pathways Decarbonization so far. We will have this meeting recorded and posted by Friday. There's additional opportunity for question and answer will be available through the platform as well. So please continue to stay connected with us and OPPD Community Connect and ask your questions or provide any additional feedback that you might think of yet tonight in regarding to this interim modeling update. We'll be accepting comments on the interim modeling update for about a week. And also, if you are interested in having us talk to your organization about this particular program and project, you can sign up for our Speakers Bureau, oppd.com/Speakers Bureau, and we can work with you to have a presentation at your organization. So with all that, we will wrap it up, Jamie, our last public comment portion for this event. If there's any questions, please use a Q&A or raise your hand.
And we do have a few, so we'll continue to kind of keep an eye on the hand raise. Click the hand to raise and lower, or through the phone, *3. We do have a couple of questions are coming in, so as we have some subject matter experts addressing those, we may, let's see if we want to address any of these verbally. There are a few questions, so bear with us. And as we prepare to answer those, I do want to acknowledge that there is one call-in user who does have a hand raised. So if we could unmute that line, Kim, please.
Hello, this is Don Preister. Am I on?
You are, Mr. Preister. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, I didn't really have a question as much as to thank Emily for her emailing with me. I just had a challenge logging in, so I've been on the phone, and want to thank everybody for the process and engaging the public. I think it is important to have these opportunities, and I am grateful for them. So thank you very much.
That was very kind of you to say. I think that without you, these we wouldn't have anyone to present these to. So thank you for attending. Emily is pretty great. So thanks for your patience in working through the login. I think you were in good company. Even a few of us had issues this morning and this afternoon. So thanks for being patient and sticking with us. Okay. Colton, is there one you'd like to tee up for either you or Zach or another member of our team?
Well, it looks like we have some more raised hands, so maybe we can keep on going through the raised hands, and
Great.
we'll maybe some of those will address the questions as we go through them.
Sure thing. Mr. Lester, I'm going to call on you.
Hi, is it through?
I can hear you, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay. Well, hi everybody. For those that remember me. Anyway, is there any incorporation that has been looked at with the upcoming infrastructure bill, the one that's bipartisan, and then the one that they're planning on doing? Because there's a potential for a lot more transmission, which we could diversify the area of wind that we would be putting in. And also there's a possibility of federal incentives for energy efficiency of buildings. Has any of that been considered yet?
Yeah, Louis. I know that the OPPD team is actively monitoring the infrastructure bill, and there's quite a bit of detail and content there. So, at this time, I think we're still in the review stage of looking at the proposed language. But we do have the ability in the modeling to expand our tie to SPP generally for energy and capacity, and so that's one of the assumptions that's being included is sort of enhancement of our tie to the regional grid.
All right. Do you want any more questions up, or wait for a second time? So.
Why don't we go ahead and address one of the ones that we have for the Q&A. Hold tight, Mr. Lester. I think that, I don't know which one you want me to throw at you, Colton.
There's the other hand raises. There are.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Vivolka, I'm going to go ahead and have you unmuted, please.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment that the major effect economists expect from a carbon price are the increased availability of breakthrough technologies, as well as increasing the pace of high electrification, rather than just the cost to OPPD of fuel.
Thanks, Alan. We do have a number of scenarios around actually accelerated declines in costs of technologies, and we have the scenarios around higher load forecasts with electrification. So I think we're monitoring the situation with carbon pricing, but I think this project will provide us a large number of pathways to be able to navigate that future as we understand it in the future.
Thank you, Colton. Mr. Preister, did you have another question, or do we need to have you *3 to lower your hand, sir? Kim, could you unmute him just to be sure, please? The call-in user. Mr. Preister, did you have another question?
No, I must have still had it on there. It didn't automatically go off.
No
Sorry.
problem. No problem at all, Don.
Thank you.
Okay. We want to go back to Lou, Colton?
Yeah, we can, and then let's go through some of the
Okay.
chatted questions.
All right. Mr. Lester, go ahead, and then that should clear out our hand raises for now.
Okay, on your scenarios, whether it's for the high electrification or base scenario with a summer peak or a winter peak, most of those are due to either would be heat pumps. Is there any assumptions on converting over to geothermal heat pumps, which would trim those peaks both summer and winter dramatically, or any type of thermal storage, which they already have the technology for today on summer peaks with ice storage? And eventually I would assume that there'd be some thermal storage that they could have in the wintertime as a add-on option.
Yep, that's a good point. So we actually do have some detailed assumptions that are available in the Workshop 2 presentation around that topic. And really it's a question of ground source heat pumps, as you say, versus air source heat pumps. Ground source heat pumps have the ability to avoid sort of some of those huge spikes in demand when it's extra cold outside. We do assume that some new construction buildings are built with ground source heat pumps, but we are not assuming that there is economic potential to retrofit a substantial number of existing homes with geothermal heat pumps as opposed to air source heat pumps. So that's what's driving that assumption.
Thank you, Zach.
Okay,
Mr.
Jamie,
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to go through the Q&A here.
Thank you. And I know we have a really good answer for your question, Mr. Welsh, that Colton might read, but we can follow up. I know we have your email. We can follow up with the full answer and refer you. There's a really good FAQ section on OPPD Community Connect for anyone who isn't aware.
Okay. I'm going to move through some of the questions that we have. There's quite a few on demand side management and energy efficiency and demand response. So the first is it correct to say that energy efficiency measures are included in the load forecast while demand response is modeled as a selectable supply side resource? Are there low EE, high EE sensitivities? And if so, what load forecasts are affected? Planned EE seems the same across all scenarios in the data release.
Yeah, so I guess to answer that question, we do have a significant quantity of what I would call very aggressive energy efficiency in our scenarios that's baked in. Assumptions about building shell retrofits, assumptions about appliance replacement, where gradually over time the stock of building shells, insulation, and appliances are gradually replaced now through 2050 with very efficient forms of that. So that is baked in. In addition to what's baked in, we have the ability for the model to additionally and incrementally select both demand response and energy efficiency programs. So that is also highlighted in workshop number, I can't remember which workshop it's in, but we have assumptions around incremental potential for energy efficiency and demand response. So not just demand response there. And finally, I will say that in workshop 2, we also, in the different load forecast scenarios that we cover, we have everything from a reference case to economy-wide net zero cases that have various levels of electrification, but that also have various levels of efficiency. And if you look in the appendix of workshop 2, you can see differing levels of efficiency assumptions between the reference case, between the moderate decarbonization case, and between the 3 different net zero cases. All of those have different load forecasts that are driven by both the differing level of electrification, but also the differing level of energy efficiency, with obviously the net zero cases having the highest level of energy efficiency. Again, that's baked in relative to the moderate case, relative to the reference case. So you can look at the appendix for what, for example, what percentage of building shells are replaced with ultra efficient building shells, or what percentage of appliances are replaced with efficient appliances.
Okay, following up on some of the incremental demand side management questions, will the annualized costs for EE and DR be made available in a future data release, and what constraints on DR are applied in the model? How many times a year could it be used, and were there time limits or hour limits for when it could be used, and how across how many hours of load can it shift?
Yes, so we can follow up with the cost information. I don't have that offhand, but I believe as a base case, we are assuming that demand response does have some constraints on how many times it can be called and how many hours it responds to per call. So I believe our assumption is 10 calls per year, and every call yields a 4-hour response. So that's the limitation of demand response. And just like with energy storage, that those constraints limit the ability of demand response to provide perfect capacity, but does provide at least some valuable capacity initially.
Okay, and then moving on, we have a question on DER. Is DER included in your modeling? Also, how does smart grid improve over the next 30 years, impact ELCC?
So we are including DER in the modeling. We have in the fourth workshop, we cover inputs and assumptions, and we cover all the different technologies that the model can select from, and DERs are a category. So there's a lot of different resources that the model can choose from. Not only can the model choose from energy efficiency and demand response, as we just discussed, but the model can also select distributed solar and distributed storage as well. Those resources have different cost profiles and they have different production profiles, but they're an option for the model to choose. I'm not quite sure what the smart grid question relating to ELCC is referring to, but yeah, I would say we don't have any explicit assumptions around that unless there's a more clarification on what that question, part of the question is asking.
Okay, thanks, Zach. And I do have another hand, and it happens to be Mr. Welsh. So I think as was stated earlier, Mr. Welsh, just please know that we're actively engaged and we monitor all of those discussions regarding carbon pricing, but we can follow up and refer you to the FAQ that has even more explicit detail about that. Did you have another question that you wanted to address? I can have Kim unmute you now.
Yes, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, I guess just to make clear, it's my understanding that the board will ultimately decide which of those pathways to get to net zero OPPD will follow, whether it's a slow process or a quick process, or in my hope, a process to get to net zero by 2035, which was on at least one of your graphs. So they will do that, I believe. And I have a question. If OPPD has looked at the possibility, this just jumped into my head, to put in ground source heat pumps and get into a new line of business where you put them in between the street and the sidewalk, for instance, in front of my home, and then run lines to the rest of the block and provide us with a ground source heat pump. Of course, everybody in the block would have to agree to that. I think a lot of my neighbors would. I think a lot of people throughout the city would. So that might be a new business opportunity for OPPD, which would reduce your peak and really all of your electric use, give you revenue from a different source.
Okay, I do want to clarify the first part, and I think we may have some comments on the second part, Mr. Welsh, on the heat pumps and sort of district heating. But on the first part, as far as the outcomes, the outcomes of what we're doing is a study. So we'll provide multiple pathways, and we're going to look for the commonalities across those pathways to understand what a robust future portfolio looks like. And so that's where this project will end, is on producing really this large variety of different pathways and the commonalities across those to be able to support future decisions. And so this particular project itself won't be making any decisions or specific recommendations on a specific pathway. We are going to look at what is robust and common across pathways. And Emily, I don't know if you're available to talk about the inclusion of maybe district systems on the community scale.
Sure, Colton. When we did our community evaluation, we'll provide a full update here in the next couple of weeks, right? So August is quickly flying by, but we did evaluate a number of various climate action plans from regionally relevant communities to see what's benchmarked out there and what OPPD's role could be as a community advocate. And we did consider district heating as part of that. And so we'll talk about those results when that update comes and where it ranked and what OPPD's role could be in that process.
Awesome. Thanks, Em. Looks
Yep.
like that might be a good one for you to attend, Mr. Welsh. And I think we have one final question and probably time just for that about inclusion in any of the scenarios for having programs for timed EV charging and eventually calling on V2G for peak reduction. Colton?
Yeah, so we are actually including assumptions around flexible EV charging, and so maybe Zach can provide some more specifics, but approximately a third of our EVs in the future load forecast would be assumed to be able to charge flexibly. And so I don't know that we have the particular programs designed or in place for what it would look to encourage that, but we're sort of assuming in our load forecast that over time, the technology will be available to us to be able to help accomplish that.
Yep, that's exactly right.
All right, thank you both. I wonder if, I think I might have one last call-in question. I think that might be Mr. Preister. Kim, would you be able to unmute him, please?
No, I didn't raise my hand.
No problem. I thought you'd lowered it before, so maybe I missed that. Thank you, sir. Okay, then I think that might wrap it up for questions that we've gotten.
Okay, thank you all for joining us today in this interim update. So we know the content was fairly technical today, and we look forward to sharing some of the preliminary or the initial results in the next workshop number 5. So we'll be sure to socialize the date for that broadly, and if you've been following along this long, please don't miss that opportunity. So good to see all the stakeholders, hear them, and appreciate your engagement. So thank you.